The unthinkable has erupted in London, as the heart of British democracy is pushed to its limits. The House of Commons is now engulfed in turmoil after waves of enraged demonstrators overwhelmed police barricades and forced their way to the gates of Parliament, chanting, "We want our country back." Sirens echoed through Westminster as police lines strained and commands vanished beneath the roar of public anger. What is unfolding tonight is something Britain has not seen in generations, with disorder exploding at the very center of power. For years, warnings grew that frustration was rising, trust in leadership was collapsing, and that one spark could unleash a storm, and that moment has arrived. London's streets are filled with defiance, and the symbol of national authority is under relentless pressure. This is no ordinary protest, it is a breaking point. It began quietly under a cold October sky, with scattered groups holding flags and handmade signs, faces marked by fatigue and resolve, but within hours the calm was shattered as chants thundered down Whitehall, growing stronger by the minute, calls for justice, demands for truth. They came from across the country, truck drivers, students, veterans, pensioners, united by a single message: enough is enough. At first, police stood shoulder to shoulder in high-visibility jackets, unmoving and expressionless, but the tension was suffocating, the silence before collapse. Reporters spoke of unrest, yet this was far more than unrest. It was anger released, and then came the surge, a shove, and a crash as metal barriers shook and finally gave way. The gates that once stood between the people and their parliament finally gave way under relentless pressure, and chaos erupted instantly. Officers were forced back as a flare streaked across the night sky, signaling the collapse of control. Radios blared with urgent calls for support, shields hit the ground, and protesters surged through the breach like a tide of fury, flags raised and voices aimed at an institution they felt had failed them. One officer dropped to a knee as the crowd pushed past, while the House of Commons, long the core of British governance, found itself surrounded. Walls that had stood through centuries of power now faced open defiance. Inside, MPs were rushed into secured areas as alarms screamed and guards shouted that the perimeter had been broken. Outside, smoke and shouting filled the air, signs demanding justice waved above the crowd, and masked figures roared into the darkness. Reinforcements arrived only to be swallowed by the sheer force of public anger, as police commands disappeared beneath chants of freedom and rejection. Cameras captured every moment, broadcasting it live as millions watched in disbelief while the once untouchable Commons became the stage for national outrage. From behind locked doors, leaders called for calm, but their voices no longer carried. As the night deepened, protest blurred into uprising, flames flickered near the gates, barriers lay crushed beside police vans, and a single cry rang out, "This is our Parliament," echoed back by hundreds. For generations, Britain prided itself on stability and order, but under flashing lights and wailing sirens, that image cracked, leaving the world watching as a chilling question hung over Westminster: had control finally slipped away? Inside Number 10, panic filled the air as the once controlled corridors of power pulsed with disorder. Sirens seeped through the windows, phones rang endlessly, and aides shouted over one another while every screen showed the same scene: the House of Commons under attack. The Prime Minister stood frozen, staring in disbelief as advisors rushed past him and police briefings arrived in blunt, urgent fragments. Containment had failed, officers were falling back, and the crowd could not be stopped. What was once unimaginable had become real: Parliament had been breached, and Downing Street spiraled into crisis. The Cabinet Secretary called for emergency meetings as security chiefs urgently discussed evacuation plans and ministers clashed over whether it was safe to address the public. Authority trembled, not from an outside threat, but from the fury of its own people. Outside, helicopters roared overhead, the city burned with flashing lights, and the Metropolitan Police, stretched to their limit, declared a critical emergency. Yet every move to restore control only intensified the rage. Across social media, live footage showed crowds flooding Parliament Square, chanting "Down with them all," the images spreading instantly and fueling the uprising. In the command room, an aide leaned in and whispered that the nation was watching and the Prime Minister needed to speak, but what words remained? A government that vowed to listen now looked silent, every statement hollow, every promise overdue. He lowered his face into his hands as another alert appeared: they had reached St. Stephen's entrance. The room fell into stunned silence, orders froze, decisions collapsed, and advisors urged him toward one final option: declare a national emergency. But he hesitated, knowing it would bring troops into the streets, curfews, and the unmistakable image of a government that had lost its grip. Fear of acting too hard collided with fear of doing nothing, and paralysis set in as the crisis deepened. Across Britain, screens blazed with the same headlines: Parliament breached, police overwhelmed, London in chaos. Outside the House of Commons, crowds waved flags in defiant triumph as the nation's authorities split open before the world. The Prime Minister took a strained call from the head of the Metropolitan Police, her voice blunt and grim. They were doing everything possible, but this was no longer a protest, it was an uprising. Silence followed. He turned to his staff and whispered, "How did it come to this?" No one answered, because they already knew: years of broken promises, ignored warnings, and a public pushed beyond its limit. Inside Parliament, trapped MPs messaged loved ones, uncertain if they would leave safely, some hope behind locked doors as chaos echoed through halls once meant for debate and justice. The bitter truth was unavoidable: those trying to reclaim democracy were tearing it apart. Finally, the Prime Minister straightened his tie and ordered a camera. Minutes later, he was live on national television, pale and hollow-eyed, sirens screaming behind him. "My fellow citizens," he began unsteadily, urging calm, but the signal flickered and cut out. When it returned, his words no longer mattered. The internet had seized control, the crowd no longer waited for authority, and their voices thundered louder than any speech. Britain was witnessing something it had not faced in centuries: leaders rendered powerless, protectors overwhelmed, and citizens unstoppable. Downing Street had shifted from a symbol of control into a shelter of fear, and as the night dragged on, a heavy truth settled in: the government had lost not only the streets, but the trust of the nation. Across the world, disbelief spread as London's turmoil became a global spectacle, with images of citizens flooding the House of Commons, the cradle of modern democracy, sending shockwaves through every major capital. In Washington, the U.S. president was briefed at once as advisors murmured that this was no protest, but Britain's collapse, while American networks cut to live coverage with banners blaring "Crisis and Parliament breached." Analysts who once praised British stability now spoke in stunned tones about the unraveling of the Western political order. In Paris, the French president convened emergency talks, fearing unrest could spill across Europe, while in Berlin officials debated the impact on markets and the risk of long-simmering movements being reignited. In Brussels, EU leaders spoke grimly, calling it the cost of British arrogance. Global markets jolted as the pound slid overnight and investors panicked, footage of retreating police looping endlessly, while economists warned that prolonged unrest could trigger the worst financial shock in modern British history. Yet this went far beyond economics. It marked the fracture of a nation once held up as a model of stability. In Moscow, state media mocked the scenes as the end of British hypocrisy, clips going viral, while Beijing echoed the message, framing the chaos as proof of Western disorder. For Britain's rivals, it was a gift. For people worldwide, it brought shock, empathy, and uneasy curiosity, as millions from New York to Delhi watched live streams from Westminster and asked a chilling question: could this happen here too? While hashtags like London Uprising and Fall of Westminster surged across global feeds, memes and raw footage turned Britain's crisis into an uncontrollable digital wildfire, as global media branded it the nation's night of reckoning. BBC reporters stood amid smoke-filled scenes at Parliament, broadcasting history in real time, with some comparing it to America's January 6th and others arguing it ran far deeper, not a riot, but the release of years of betrayal and despair. Foreign embassies quietly locked down and prepared exits, as the world's oldest democracy appeared besieged not by outside forces, but by its own citizens. As dawn approached, government thinking shifted from shock to strategy. In Washington, defense analysts openly debated NATO's future, while in Brussels officials questioned whether Britain could still be seen as a stable partner. Even Canada and Australia issued measured calls for calm, diplomatic words that barely concealed real concern. Yet the most unsettling realization came from Britain's allies themselves: this might not be an isolated event. Across Europe and America, resentment toward leadership had been building, and Britain's televised breakdown had simply struck the spark. News networks replayed the breach again and again, the moment the illusion of control collapsed, while commentators called it a turning point in global politics, summed up by one haunting headline: "If it can happen in Britain, it can happen anywhere." As daylight crept over Westminster, the smoke cleared but the damage stood undeniable: smashed barriers, scorched ground, abandoned shields, all marking a nation rattled to its core. Small groups of protesters lingered, exhausted yet defiant, their voices unbroken, while police cautiously reformed lines amid the wreckage, no longer projecting dominance, only trying to hold what remained. The streets settled into an eerie calm, the silence after upheaval, heavy with uncertainty about what came next. Inside the corridors of power, leaders confronted a reckoning they could no longer postpone. Emergency laws were rushed forward, inquiries pledged, commissions announced, yet public faith was already shattered. Rehearsed assurances and familiar rhetoric no longer landed. Trust, once broken, could not be restored overnight. Britain woke to a stark new reality: its democracy wounded, its institutions questioned, its future uncertain. Schools, offices, and transport resumed under heavy security, but conversation everywhere returned to a single focus as images from the night before looped endlessly on screens, met with silence, anger, or disbelief. Families argued, co-workers clashed, strangers exchanged guarded looks, and the nation's divisions were no longer hidden, but openly exposed. Historians would later debate when Britain truly changed, but for those who lived it, the answer was clear: it was the night citizens crossed a line they never imagined crossing, and the state proved unable to stop them. What followed would not be settled by one speech or election, but by years of struggle to rebuild legitimacy, restore dialogue, and confront grievances ignored for too long. The storm had not passed, it had merely shifted into a new phase. As Britain stood on the edge of an uncertain future, one truth rang louder than ever: stability once assumed now had to be earned again. In the days that followed, the aftershocks spread far beyond London, with regional cities seeing renewed demonstrations, smaller but charged with the same defiance. Town squares became forums for debates once kept private, as ordinary citizens who had never protested before spoke openly about broken systems, rising costs, and leaders who no longer spoke for them, signaling that the restraint long associated with British public life had dissolved, replaced by an uncompromising demand to be heard. Parliament eventually returned under intense security, its sessions broadcast with rare openness in an effort to rebuild credibility. Lawmakers spoke of unity, reform, and accountability, but their words landed carefully, burdened by the memory of broken gates and collapsing police lines. Committees were established to examine how the breach occurred and why warnings were ignored, yet many doubted whether explanations alone could restore confidence. International pressure quietly increased as allies urged stability while bracing for prolonged uncertainty. Trade talks slowed, diplomatic meetings were delayed, and Britain's position on the global stage began to wobble. A nation once seen as a symbol of predictability was now approached with caution, its image of exceptionalism fractured to reveal weaknesses shared by many modern democracies. Among the public, reflection blended with determination. Some felt pride in forcing attention onto long-neglected issues, while others felt regret, fearing the damage might be irreversible. Families spoke of the night in subdued voices, aware that history had shifted in ways not yet defined, as children asked questions adults struggled to answer. Britain moved forward without confidence, but with awareness. The sense of permanence was gone, institutions were no longer untouchable, and authority was no longer assumed. What remained was a choice: whether the rupture would harden into lasting division or mark the beginning of true renewal. The answer was still unwritten, but one truth was clear: the night Parliament was breached would be remembered not only for its chaos, but as the moment the nation was forced to face itself.